Barbaro.
Thank you, Janice. I'm glad to be with all of you. So welcome. We are going to be talking about ambiguous loss, or living effectively with uncertainty. Let me just run through the session objectives. Hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be learning some concepts about ambiguous loss and why it's important. We're going to explore how it differs from traditional loss and grief. And I'm hoping that you'll take away some strategies toward increasing tolerance of ambiguity and change. So ambiguous loss, there is a unique kind of loss that complicates grief, confuses relationships, and prevents closure. And it is called ambiguous loss. An ambiguous loss is a loss that's unclear, it has no resolution, and it has no closure. That's the definition of it. It's a theory that was coined by Pauline Boss, PhD. Actually, she came up with this back in the 70s when she was working on her dissertation. And it happens in two situations. And the first one we're going to begin with is that dementia creates ambiguous loss, both for the caregiver, but also she talks about it does create ambiguous loss for people with early memory loss, early dementia, those people who have awareness about their condition. And in this situation, it is the person is physically present, but psychologically or emotionally absent or changed from how they once were. Coping for someone or caring for someone with dementia causes much stress, overwhelm, and helplessness. And she explains that when a loved one is lost only partially, the ambiguity coupled with the loss is a powerful barrier to both coping and grieving. When you are living with an illness, and I'm going to switch it up a little bit today. We normally talk just about ambiguous loss and caregiving, but it's really hit me that what we are all living in right now with COVID-19 also incorporates ambiguous loss. So when we're living in a situation where there's no cure or predicted outcome, both in dementia and COVID-19, hope lies in our perception and our ability to change. And therein lies the window of hope. Ambiguous loss, I want to tell you a little bit about how I stumbled across this and then how it's become part of what we offer patients and families. You know, we always have looked at and studied stress and burden of caregivers. And that was always challenging to work with because clearly that is the case, but figuring out how to help people manage that was always a challenge. And what was at the core of that? Back in 2016, I was preparing for a presentation in the community, and I ran across this theory, and a light bulb just went off in my head. It was like the core of this is this unrecognized grief that caregivers face. And it has to do with losses related to absence and presence. In that presentation, I just mentioned the concept, and it was fascinating how people just kind of sat up and took notice. And then I had an opportunity, like Janice said, I get to meet with patients and families most every day. And in the course of those conversations, in the course of those visits and assessments, it became clear that caregivers were grieving. And when I would talk about this, people would cry. I mean, and it's like, oh, it really is. It's not me. This really is a thing. And that's when we decided that we wanted to explore this a little bit more and be able to provide more information for our patients and families. So ambiguous loss happens in two situations, as I mentioned. Dementia is one of them, where the person is partially lost. And the other one is a physical body is absent, but psychologically the person is still present to the family and loved ones. I think the most recent example of that is the Malaysian airline that really literally disappeared several years ago. It's difficult for families to come to terms with that because there's no verification of death. And so it happens when the body is missing, but the family, loved ones are holding on. And in dementia, the body's present, but psychologically the person is changed or absent from how they had previously been. Now, dementia is not the only example of that. That certainly can happen possibly with mental illness or substance abuse or other situations where a person is partially present. Ambiguous loss is non-traditional. Not only do others not recognize the loss, but often the caregivers don't even perceive it as grief. I mean, they know there's loss, but they've never thought of it as grief. And the changes can be confusing and unpredictable. The trauma felt by caregivers is often immobilizing, as the ambiguity surrounding the psychological loss of the person with dementia and not knowing what is going to disappear next is also kind of that roller coaster experience of that person being lost with occasional flashes of returning that adds to the confusion. And this also, again, I think we're experiencing some of that in living with this virus. The basic premise of ambiguous loss is when a person is lost only partially, the ambiguity coupled with the loss creates a powerful barrier to both coping and grieving. This really helped me understand why caregivers so often feel traumatized and stuck, really having trouble making decisions that need to be made, but not knowing, is it the right decision? Is it the right time to do it? They're unable to recognize that they're grieving. And Dr. Boss calls this frozen grief. It tends to immobilize caregivers at times, not sure what task to do, what action to take, or what roles to play. So how does it differ from other losses? Well, first of all, it complicates grief. And complicated grief usually means that it goes on too long. Well, dementia certainly can go on too long. It can go on for a number of years, up to 20 years. But grieving the loss of someone who's still alive is a complication that's really confusing. How do you grieve somebody who's standing in front of you? And having to accept the loss and acknowledge the need to grieve is also confusing, because when we think about grief, we've always attached it to when someone dies. And we know how to do that. We know the template of that, that there's going to be some kind of funeral or celebration of life. People are going to support us for probably at least about a year. We have an understanding, and it's very hard. That's not to diminish how difficult that loss is, but it's not ambiguous. Complicated loss creates complicated grief. But what Dr. Boss really focuses on is that the pathology is not with the caregiver. The pathology is the type of loss. It's a complicated loss, but it is a result of the ambiguity caused by the dementia. And another way she says that is the caregiver isn't messed up, the situation is. So that's the other part of the complication of this type of loss. The other complication is the continued losses. Dementia creates losses ongoing. There's multiple losses throughout the disease progression. So your grief is ongoing, and it can go on for years. It's that sadness and the confusion that sometimes the person has lucidity and you wonder if something's wrong with yourself. And then you see losses continue. And I mentioned before, she calls that frozen grief, inability to get things done, and keeps us feeling stuck and hopeless often. What I love about her theory also along with this is that she really feels strongly that what looks like depression is often sadness, what looks like anxiety is often stress, and the confusion that comes by the inability to fix the situation. So this really helps to demedicalize this. So often, people, caregivers, may see a counselor and they're diagnosed, or a physician, and they're diagnosed with depression or anxiety, when in fact, this is just this is ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss next confuses relationships. It can rupture relationships with family, friends, and lead to isolation, which is a core component to what many caregivers feel. And it's so unfortunate because, at the time you hope family and friends can come together, it sometimes is just the opposite, with a lot of conflict between all kinds of family members for lots of different reasons. Dr. Boss suggests that one time, when we see that often families may not be on the same page, she calls it asynchronous grief. Different family members are in different stages and on different routes in their own grieving process. I think that's kind of an interesting perception. And she highly recommends the importance of grieving as you go. Give yourself permission to grieve, both as a caregiver and what we're facing now in this pandemic, when things have dramatically changed. Our life as we know it has dramatically changed. We don't feel like we know what's normal anymore. We feel like we know what's going to change in the future, and we don't know how that's going to look. So there is some loss and grief that goes with that, and it's important to recognize that, to honor that. The other thing she thinks is important about grieving as you go is that doing it with other people, of marking those losses along the way. And I want to tell you a story about that I think demonstrates that, because often people will say, well, how do you mark it? Well, this one example was we had been doing a therapy group on ambiguous loss, and we're in the middle of that. And in one session, a woman came in and she said, before we start, I have to tell you something. And she went on to explain that all of her married life, she was caring for her husband who had dementia. All of her married life, her husband had always opened the door for her. Car doors, garage door, whatever the door was, he always opened it. And the week before she came in, they had come home from grocery shopping, parked the car in the garage. He didn't open the car door, which she thought was interesting, but he went ahead of her and went through the garage door into the home, and the door slammed in her face. And she burst out crying because she recognized that as, oh my gosh, this is another loss. And she couldn't wait to get to this group who she knew would understand, to share this with them, because she knew that they were the ones that would understand. So it's important to mark those losses, to recognize them, to share them, so that they can move through you, that you don't hold those and focus on those unnecessarily. This is just a slide about the impact of dementia, and really what this is it can be, when I'm working in a group, I ask caregivers, what have their losses been? And pretty much this sums it up. The change in the relationship and the intimacy, the companionship, the communication. I remember one woman saying, it's not important talk. I say that it's nothing talk between my husband and I, how it used to be. But now we don't even have that, just little things that come to mind throughout the day. Certainly the change in shared hobbies and the freedom to take part in activities or work independently, future plans and implementing care, that the roles, of course, change. Now this slide, there are a couple of reasons for this. Betty Anderson, you can see on the bottom, this was part of a workbook for dementia caregivers. And her thinking about this is actually a model that was developed by William Bridges in a book called Transitions. And he talked about how the stages of change, that there's in every change we make, a positive change or a negative change, there's an ending, a transition zone, and a new beginning. And I want you to, I think it's very interesting. So her point is that if you look at the ending stage, we're focusing on what is left behind, what ceases to be, letting go, and loss, grief, anger, the blues, if you will. Through that, we often then move into what we call a transitional or neutral zone. And he called it the wilderness. This is the zone that people don't like to live in. We like to be in control. We like to know where we are and where we're going and get done with it. But as we're going through change, this is where we move from old to new. There's apprehension, there's uncertainty and tension, and look at the last one, ambiguity. And I think that this transition zone is where many of us are now in living with this pandemic, as well as in caregiving. But over time, hopefully, ideally, there's I always think of it as a little sprout coming out of the ground, that something's growing, that we start focusing on new roles. Work involves a shift in our attitude, alignment, and gains. And Betty Anderson's point is that most of these losses with dementia are all about the ending. And her point is also that we adjust more readily to changes that we choose, not that we, in dementia, pandemic is certainly nothing that we chose. And I think that's true. But what I like about the theory of ambiguous loss is it's about changing our perceptions. And it gives us kind of a model to do that, of not only focusing on the loss, but looking at what the gain could possibly be. And I think that's such a strength of this theory. Virginia Satir noted one time, life is not the way it's supposed to be, it's the way that it is. The way you cope with that is what makes the difference. So why is ambiguous loss important? And I have a bunch of slides on this. I think the first one is about changing our perceptions. Understanding ambiguous loss provides a pathway for caregivers to accept and live with the new reality. And that's what I really fell in love with it the first time. Because it has to do with changing our perceptions. When we can't control the disease, when we can't control a pandemic, we can control or we can change our perceptions, thereby finding some hope, a way to live with this. And this, as I said, goes back to the last slide of living with dementia, looking ahead, new roles, work, and this has to do with recognizing some gains along with the losses. It allows us to appreciate our person for who they are now instead of longing for the person they once were. And it's a more effective use of energy, and it helps us redefine our relationship so that we can find joy and connection in the relationship with the person of who they are now, not who they once were. I want to give you a story about that too. I think sometimes stories can really illustrate it better than just talking about it. I met a couple several years ago that I was just so taken by, and this was their first visit with them. The husband had dementia, and the wife was the primary caregiver. And he had been a very prominent doctor, had been very goal-directed. They had a very good marriage, but they really had, in many ways, kind of their separate life. She continues. She was still working, and they were in their 80s. And by the time I met them, by the time they first came to us, he was in the moderate stage of dementia. So he had not been working for some time. And I was so taken by the interaction between the two of them. There were sometimes during the conversation that he would lose track and was having trouble understanding. And I was so taken that she just naturally would kind of rub his arm and look him in the eye and validate, what he was saying. And then that was fine, and then we could move on. And it was just so seamlessly, beautifully done. He, at one point, had to use the restroom, so I showed him where that was, and I just came back for a moment and said to her, how do you do that? And, you know, she didn't know anything about ambiguous loss. She hadn't taken any classes. She just looked at me and smiled, and she said, you know, when this started happening, I realized that he wasn't going to be the same person he had been before. But I've come to realize that he has some traits and behaviors now that I never saw in his earlier life. And what she meant by that is that in his career, he was very goal-directed. He was wonderful with his patients, and that was much of his life. That was fine with her. It worked fine for her. But now he was appreciative. He told her how much he loved her, how grateful he was. And they also had a wonderful thing that they shared, that he loved blondes. Now, she was blonde. I'm not. And so we had a little humor around that. But where that came into play is that I learned that to allow her to continue her career, she hired 2 lovely young caregivers who were blonde. And he loved the whole idea that now he was surrounded by this bevy of blondes. So I just think this is a beautiful example of how relationships change, because their relationship dramatically changed because of this disease, but how she was able to shift what she focused on made all the difference in the world. Another reason why it's important, changing our perceptions. We can't control the disease, but we can control or change how we think about it. I have another story I want to share about this as well. This is kind of on the opposite end. This is a woman I'm going to call Sherry. She married later in life, not until she had found the man of her dreams. And now they were in their 70s. They'd only been married about 10 years, and he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. There were some pretty significant changes in his ability to communicate, and certainly to engage in the things that they love doing together, just travel, entertaining. He had to stop working earlier than he had hoped. And on his good days, there were kind of less word-finding problems, and he was, to begin with, pretty content and happy. But then there were more bad days, or days that weren't so good, where he would become really frustrated. He had been a really proficient handyman, and he could no longer do something as simple as hang a picture. And when she would try to help, he would be very angry, and it would be directed at her. I met her early on when I was just learning about this, and she, to me, there was so much anger and so much sadness and resentment that I saw her as the picture of ambiguous loss. It stopped her ability to make decisions that were really important, that he not drive, for example. And she didn't make decisions early in the stage about, financial or legal decisions that would have been very helpful. She wasn't able to do that. And when I would talk with her about that, she'd just say, I'm not ready to face it. She was stuck. She was unable to accept the new reality of dementia because she could only long for the person she had lost. She couldn't find anything that could be hopeful to her. Now, I have to give her credit. She tried to attend a couple of caregiver groups, but got very angry and was very irritated that when anybody in one of those groups would suggest that it had been helpful for them to kind of find new friends to fill in the gaps that they weren't able to have with their spouse anymore. And she couldn't make sense of that. She could never do that. She just continued to focus on everything being lost. She couldn't find any meaning in the situation or find any hope. And this was her new reality, and she didn't know if she could find her way out of it. So there, deciding to change is really, or deciding to change our perceptions is really a choice. Deciding to change the way we think about this doesn't mean we're resigned to it. It doesn't mean we have to like it. We're changing our expectations can create a different shift in our mood, our day, our energy, and our life. And she was facing losses every day. There was always uncertainty, wondering, is this going to be a good day or a bad day? But what can help is to decide to learn and practice becoming more comfortable with that uncertainty. And that's what Ambiguous Loss helps us to do. It provides guidelines to help develop our own plan for the person we love while caring for ourselves. And that's the other thing that I loved about this. You know, when you talk to caregivers about taking care of themselves, their eyes roll in the back of their head. It's like, are you kidding me? How am I going to do that? But this, you do both and it's going to make sense as we go on. And it's a model to increase resiliency. Dr. Boss says that with a little help, people can learn to balance the grief over what was lost with the recognition of what is still possible. The guidelines that we're talking about are 7 guidelines in a book called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. And her intervention is based on a stress resiliency model. That one, living with grief, there's no need to get over it, and the type of loss matters. That this ambiguous loss is very different, primarily because there's no rituals and it's so unrecognized. So it, just to finish up here, it offers fluid considerations toward development of our own plan of caring for ourselves. It allows us to provide care and take care of ourselves as care partners. Because what we know is that when caregivers they have positivity, their lives are, they're doing things that bring pleasure to them, that really resonates with the person with dementia. The happier the caregiver is, the less stressed the caregiver is. The chances of behavioral problems lessen dramatically. It helps us increase our comfort with the uncertainty of the situation and future situations. And we become more comfortable not knowing the ending. These are just some resiliency reflections that caregivers have shared, that after learning this and practicing this, caregivers feel that it can make them stronger. They're proud of their flexibility that can increase their strength and adaptation, seeing the upside, not just the losses and changes, feeling more comfortable with the uncertainty of life. And Dr. Boss talks about how it increases our maturity. And once caregivers go through this, once they learn and practice the guidelines, they find joy and they're very proud of their ability to, quote, go with the flow and not fight these previous expectations. Carl Jung noted, meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. And as with the pandemic and ambiguous loss, I think that's a very similar sentiment. Okay, so how do we start here? How do we begin? Well, the first I mentioned the book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, and I would really highly recommend it. 3 things to get started here. First is to name the problem. Having a name for the problem is therapeutic. It has a name, it makes it real. It can help us name the experience. Understanding the partial loss creates ambiguity, and it creates a barrier to coping and thinking. Now, the second one is a skill that's really important, and it is called paradoxical thinking. Both and thinking instead of either or. It's holding 2 conflicting ideas in our brain, both that are true, and it helps reframe our perception of the situation and a diagnosis that can't be changed. So let me give you a simple example of that. The first would be, I both need to care for my mother and take care of myself. There's no one right answer. Both of them are true. And it helps us understand the trust that things can work out. Now, I have an exercise here I'd like us to try. And if I can remind everybody, if you can unmute your speaker for this, your microphone for this. I'd like you to take a moment and answer this question. As a result of caregiving, I have lost blank and I have gained blank. Or I'd like you to answer a question, as a result of the pandemic, I have lost blank and I have gained blank. I'm just going to give you a minute. Think about that, and then if there are anybody willing to share their responses, I'd love to hear them.
And this is Janice. One of the ways you can also participate in this discussion is if you're new to Skype, you might notice that there's a little chat bubble in the bottom left corner. If you click on that, like Beth is doing right now, you can go in there and you can fill in the blank. So you can just fill in 2 words. So you can say, as a result of the caregiving or the pandemic, I have lost and fill in the blank, and then I have gained and fill in the blank.
Anybody ready to share a response?
Here we go. Susie, we've got one.
Okay.
As a result of the caregiving or pandemic, I have lost freedom and I have gained appreciation for what I have.
Nice, nice.
And now we have another one. It says, from Beth, as a result of the pandemic, I have lost the opportunity to hug my grandma, but we have gained the opportunity to have silly video chats.
Nice.
I love that.
That is wonderful. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, both of those, that was wonderful about new things that we never thought could happen. I was on before when this started, someone was on and we were talking about the new thing for me is learning some more about technology. I never thought, I didn't want it, I didn't like it, but it's like, okay, you better get over that. I've gained that. I'm not proficient, but I'm getting closer.
You are amazing. And we have 3 more now.
Oh, wonderful. Let's go.
You ready? Okay, from Carrie. As a result of the pandemic, I have lost my freedom to go out when I want, but I have gained quality family time.
Wonderful. Yep, exactly what we're talking about.
And then from Gina, as a result of caregiving, I have lost faith and hope, and I have become humbled.
Wow.
Do you want to speak to that one for a minute?
Become humbled. Well, that's exciting to me to imagine what is going to be in the future based on that. That sounds like a really big shift that can have some amazing outcomes in the future.
Okay, here we go with Jennifer. I have lost money, but I have gained time with my daughter.
Wonderful.
Cheryl, as a result of the pandemic, I have lost distractions of going out, but have gained some self-acceptance.
Wow, we're going to have a whole crowd of new people.
I know, they're so powerful. Okay, here we go. Amy says, as a result of caregiving, we have lost some freedom, but gained patience and understanding.
Look at all of these gains. I mean, that's what's so phenomenal. Sometimes at our worst, both in caregiving and the pandemic, it's like, how is this ever going to end? And yet, you balance that off by the gains we're hearing, And it helps buoy you. It's hope. It's like, okay, we can do this, and we're going to become stronger because of it.
Absolutely. We have another one. Okay, from Karen, as a result of caregiving, I have lost some of my freedom and have gained quality time with my mom that I otherwise would not have had.
Yes, yes. And that's one, I love that one.
So good. And you know, as we move on through this presentation, you all can keep using the chat bar. We are going to have a question and answer time at the end. So if you think of a question and you want to jot it in the chat line, we'll come back to it at the end. Or if it fits in the presentation, I'll ask Susie at the time.
I really commend those of you that did this, because this is often very difficult for people to do. And I want to warn you, not warn you, but just give you a heads up, that if you practice this with somebody, you're meeting with somebody, and they're not, sometimes they're not, they can tell you what they've lost, but sometimes as a caregiver, they've said, I don't think I've made any gains. And just acknowledge that. That's okay. You'll give it some thought, and we can talk about it next time. And 9 times out of 10, they will come back, and they will be able to come up with something regarding that. It's a powerful tool. It's just a wonderful way, because so often, well, I mentioned that before, when we're thinking about our caregiving experiences, we're all focused, we're always on the losses. That's what we focus on, the stress, the burden, the losses. This is just a concrete way to recognize that within that, there may be something gained. So naming the problem is huge. And for many people, that's enough. That's enough to help them feel more comfortable with this. But this is a skill that can really bring that home. And then the third one is a kind of a concept about accepting less than perfect solutions and finding the middle ground. And this has to do with it's letting go of control of the things we can't control. We can't change the course of dementia. We can't put this virus back in a bottle. But we can change our perceptions by accepting less than perfect solutions. And so much of what Dr. Boss talks about is, one, know that you're doing the best you can, that good enough is good enough. These principles she talks about are really the hardest for people that tend to be perfectionists, that have lived their life defining a problem, working on it, solving it, and moving on. And with these situations, that's not going to work so well. So much of it has to do with accepting less than perfect solutions.
Susie, we have a comment from Gina. It says, this sounds like the AA 12-step prayer.
Wow, yeah, it does. It's very similar. Okay, well, let's move on to the guidelines. So these guidelines in her book, and this is, in this therapy group, I use the book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. And it was such a challenge to try to pull out the most important components of this, because it all was important. But so really what we focused on is these 7 guidelines. Let me explain what these guidelines are. They are not a to-do list. They are fluid and they're flexible. Not all of them need the same amount of attention, not necessarily to be done in any order. The goal of these 7 guidelines is for you to reflect on them and tailor them to meet your specific needs. Again, the goal is not perfection, it's to do the best you can. Finding meaning is the first one. So finding meaning is to make sense of a situation. That's really difficult to do, and everything you thought you knew about the relationship has changed. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, was the first to connect meaning to hope. There's no meaning without hope, and there's no hope without meaning. And how he did that in that horrific situation is he grouped people in his mind as either decent or indecent. And in so doing, he recognized that some of his captors probably were pretty decent people, but they found themselves in a very indecent situation. And he found, he came to understand, he was a believer that nobody gets through this life without some suffering. And that suffering ceases to be suffering when you find meaning in it, such as sacrifice. So that that paradoxical thinking can help us with that. I'm thinking about, so the guidelines too, that most of these guidelines really fit with the pandemic. So like with dementia, finding meaning means making sense out of the situation. And when it's ambiguous, it's hard to do, to minimize our feelings, but it's essential to do, to minimize our feelings of hopelessness and helpfulness. In the uncertainty, we often focus on what's been lost, not always recognizing what we can learn from it, the experience, or how we are growing. And when I asked a caregiver recently about losses and gains, I thought this was kind of interesting. And about the pandemic, and specifically, he said he and his wife had lost the way that they had been living and gained the opportunity to try new things. And this is reflective of what you all said as well. An example of that too is a great one, a caregiving couple that live on a golf course, and how they've found meaning in this pandemic when they are socially isolated from friends and neighbors. They've come up with a new scenario. All of the families here, or many of the families, have golf carts, and there are 9 couples. They situate their golf carts at least 6 feet apart from each other in a circle on the golf course, and have a regularly scheduled meeting in these golf carts, which I thought was fabulous.
I just love that, Susie. And we have another comment. We have a comment from Lori. It says, appreciate the application of Frankel's work, which validates these principles.
Yeah, absolutely. He went on to develop logotherapy, and yeah, it's amazing. So finding meaning is the first guideline. Now, we move on now to balance control with acceptance. And this has to do with tempering our mastery. When we can't control what life brings us, whether it be dementia or a pandemic, we can master our internal selves. It's important for us to be able to control something. I mean, my goodness, we are a controlling society, if you will. We want to be in control. But we can master our inner thoughts, our reactions, and our inner selves. When we can't fix or solve the problems, we can decide to become more comfortable living with that uncertainty. And we can make a conscious decision to be okay with unanswered questions or problems that can't be solved. They're outside of our control. We just need to let those go and control what we can. So things we can control as caregivers. Well, we can control how we ask for help when we need it. We can decide to take care of ourselves while we're caring for another person. With the pandemic, what can we control? We can wash our hands. We can do social distancing. We can wear a mask. This helps us and allows us to embrace the uncertainty, to decide not to let this ambiguity terrorize us. The third guideline to cope is broadening our identity. And what that has to do with is answering the question, who am I now once that I'm a caregiver? Who am I now that my husband is no longer an equal partner? Or who am I now that my mother doesn't know who I am? And this is about revising our identity to fit the new situation. Dr. Voss talks about dementia really causing, it's a relationship condition as well as a medical condition, because it changes relationships not only with the person, but with other people, often in your family or in your support group. And it demands that as care partners, we really examine our roles, and our roles as they change through the dementia process. We need to examine family roles, and what are the rules? Are there certain people in the family that are supposed to be the caregivers and other people are excused from that? And what about families that maybe are not supportive when we need that support? And that goes into the idea of developing a psychological family. You need to broaden your identity. If you can't get the support and help that you need within your biological family, then you find people who can back you up, who are willing and ready to provide that role. So it's broadening our concept of who we are and what kind of help we need and how that connects with these relationships. She really talks about really examining family roles, that's important, and to become clear on that so that one person isn't taking this on alone, because that's more than is feasible to manage. The fourth guideline is about managing mixed emotions, and that has to do with normalizing ambivalence. So ambivalence is that the positive and negative emotions that happen that we feel simultaneously, like love and hate. For caregivers, it's often, I wish this was over, but then this horrible guilt of what that would mean. And Dr. Boss has noted that ambiguity feeds ambivalence, and ambivalence feeds the uncertainty about which action to follow, which decision to make, and which role to play, or which task to perform. And again, that's that frozen grief, that's inability to do what needs to be done because of these mixed emotions. In the pandemic, these mixed emotions that result from the grief of this, and it's normal to have mixed feelings. When we have these feelings of fear, anxiety, anger, strain, and tension when we're grieving. I mean, that's a part of the grieving process. And so it's important to recognize these, to grieve as we go, to share these feelings so that we don't act on them. As a caregiver, for example, if we're frustrated, to not take that out on the person that we care about. And that may mean, certainly talking to friends, sharing that with friends or a professional. But a lot of it too is recognizing that this is normal and natural. One thing in the caregiving realm that Dr. Boss often asks a caregiver when she hears this from a caregiver, that I wish it was over, but then I feel so guilty what that would mean, is she asks the question, are you wishing these things because you are suffering or the person with dementia is suffering? Because they may not be. And I think that's really an insightful question to ask. Okay, hold on and let go. And that's the next one. That has to do with attachment. I recall the story of Sherry, the once ideal relationship that was then totally changed when her husband got dementia. What was a attachment that was satisfying then suddenly became an attachment that produced a lot of anxiety. And so the goal is to resolve the attachment as opposed to detach it and becoming more comfortable with the ambiguity, not denying the loss of the relationship. And how do you do that? Well, you can do it by choosing to accept less than perfect relationships, letting go while remembering that the loved one is both here and gone. Grieve what you've lost and celebrate what you still have. The importance of finding new human connections is so vital. And I remember in one group, a woman said, "You mean it's okay to go out with friends?" And it's like, no, it's not only okay, it's really important. that those connections feed you, and you need to supplement that when connections have been lost elsewhere. And alleviate our expectation of closure, that there is not going to be closure with this. In fact, Dr. Boss talks about closure is kind of a myth. It's good for real estate dealings, but not so good with human relationships. And noting that, even when somebody dies, we don't really shut them out of our lives. There's really no closure. I mean, if they've been close to us, they've certainly are in our heart and become kind of the fabric of our life, if you will. So there's the expectation of closure is not realistic. Attachment is defined. It may remain, but the relationship is changed and different, and understanding that it's less reciprocal than it was. The sixth one is imagining new hopes and dreams. And I think that is certainly one too that affects both caregiving and the pandemic. And the one story, so new hopes and dreams has to do not only when you're in the situation, but also thinking of hopes and dreams when that situation changes. So it's kind of two parts. And as caregivers, people say, well, how can I have new hopes and dreams while I'm doing this, while I'm taking, all my time is caregiving. A great story of a woman who was sharing that all her life, she was caring for her husband, and her husband now was in about the moderate stage. They weren't going out, obviously, as much as they had been. But all her life, she had wanted to learn to play the piano. And out of the blue one day, she got a postcard from a woman in the neighborhood who was offering piano lessons for adults. And she thought, I could do that. I could make this work. So by the time she came into the group, she had taken 3 piano lessons. She had learned 3 songs, and she was so proud and so excited that after dinner now, she and her husband would sit down to the piano. He would have his little glass of wine, and she would play her songs. And that became a kind of a ritual, something that they enjoyed that time of the day together. So that was kind of a new dream that she was able to accomplish while she was providing care. New dreams and hopes are hard to come to sometimes. Sometimes, people say, I just don't have time, or I can't do that. But it's important to think about that, because those dreams and hopes are the things that energize us, the things that infuse us with hopefulness and happiness. So imagining new hopes and dreams as we continue to grapple with the uncertainty and the ambiguity of caregiving and the pandemic, we may want to rethink what we hope for. Now, hope can be an impediment if it's not realistic. So it needs to be realistic, like the piano. That was something that she certainly could do. When a person is psychologically changed due to the dementia, we need to modify our hopes and dreams of how to stay connected to them connected to them as they are now, instead of longing for how they used to be. And with the pandemic, it's important to remind ourselves that this is temporary, even though it doesn't feel like it. We need to name our mixed feelings for what they are and what we're grieving. Naming it and accepting it can give us permission to grieve and live in the moment and allow ourselves to hope and dream for present and future possibilities. The last one gets down, and remember, no meaning without hope and no hope without meaning. And this is about the hope about taking time to mind yourself. It's not selfish as a caregiver. It's not selfish living through the pandemic. It's instead self-preservation. And so the strategies for that are pretty similar. Certainly thinking about exercise, hobbies, taking breaks, connecting to supportive people, and now often virtually more than just in person. Identifying ways to calm ourselves through mindfulness or spirituality and being present. And as importantly, avoid trying to be perfect. So those are the 7 guidelines in that book, kind of in a nutshell, that are pretty powerful. So to increase your comfort living with ambiguity, we want to let go of your need for certainty and embrace it, to change your perceptions of the situation or the diagnosis that can't be changed. And the goal is greater acceptance, not closure. Understanding that we can become stronger from adversity and more mature with a greater depth of understanding. Changing our perception is one thing we can control, living each day as it comes to stay present and find something to laugh about. We can find hope in ambiguity and find meaning in the relationship as change. Understanding that life brings us a great deal of ambiguity. And boy, if we haven't learned that lesson today, I don't know when we're going to learn that. It's really finding to see the good in ambiguity, that we are capable of living with uncertainty. And it means some things aren't going to have answers and might not be available. And not every question is going to have an answer, or every problem is going to have a solution. But it can help us understand ourselves better. And you all demonstrated that just in that simple exercise. Things that can help: becoming more comfortable, embracing it, redefining justice, gaining some control, even when ambiguity continues. And I think Dr. Boss says it best in this slide. When you love someone with dementia, the goal is not perfection. The new standard for your relationship is simply for it to be good enough. Life with dementia can be less than ideal and still pretty good. And that perceptual shift is under your control. So I want to stop there. Janice, do you want to stop there for just a moment? You said there were some questions or comments. Do we want to take some of those right now?
I'm not seeing any questions pop up right now, Susie, but I just want to remind folks that if you do have questions for Susie, right now is the perfect opportunity to ask them. And you can just go again to that little chat bubble in the bottom left corner if you have never used it before, or some of you who have used it today, if you have questions for Susie, if you want to just type those in and I'll ask those to her. But to get us started, one of the things that you talked about was control, and to change our perception about what we can control. And you said one of the things that we can control is how we ask for help. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me how would you recommend people ask for help, and what kind of things should they be asking for help for?
Good question. And I'd like to have people chime in as well when you've got some thoughts as well. So first of all, often people say when they learn that you are caring for someone or they've been part of this process, they'll say, well, let me know what I can do to help. So many times caregivers don't follow up on that. I suggest that you keep a list of things that would be helpful. And it could be anything from taking my car to get gassed up, or taking it through a car wash, or this is a little bit more of an ask now, of maybe bringing groceries in once in a while, or preparing a meal, or coming to stay with my person so I can go play bridge for a couple of hours. It's one taking the initiative. Well, that's not even initiative. When someone says, what can I do to help? Have a list and think about what, sometimes it's helpful to pair what a person would enjoy doing to what you're asking them to do. Or you could give them the whole list and say, hey, do any of these things sound like something you'd be willing to do? That's one suggestion that I have. I think the other thing is that good friends, people in your church, people in groups that you're in, whether they offer or not, it's worth the ask. You're not going to know if you don't ask them. And you're sometimes surprised that they will, and family members as well. And I want to, you certainly, I don't necessarily need to start there, but that is very reasonable to say something. It can be as simple as a couple that maybe has 2 or 3 kids, adult children. They have grandchildren as well. And when I talk to them about, gee, how often do you see them, and what kind of interaction? Well, they're too busy. Well, you know what? This is part of family. By them, these adult children interacting and helping out, kind of models for their children that's what family does. So this can be an opportunity for family to learn some lessons together and become closer.
I love that. I love both those ideas. When you were telling me about it, it reminded me of the story that our director, Lori Nissen, shared with us about how she knew a gentleman who actually did keep that list in his pocket. And when somebody would ask, what can I do to help? He'd just pull it right out.
There you go.
It just matches what you're saying. Oh, yeah. We have a quote, we have a comment from Carrie, and it's about this final slide that you have up here. It says, I love this final slide. Yeah. It takes some thought, but is so validating.
Isn't it? She is, you've got to read the book. She's in her 80s now. She is who I want to be when I grow up. I mean, just amazing. And her just the thoughtfulness and the depth of what she has to say and what she has to teach us is just amazing. And I can tell you from my experience of doing these groups, I mean, this has been a game changer. This has been a game changer for people. It helps, it's so interesting because it doesn't change anything except a person's belief that they can change the way they think of something. And that's the one thing, that's probably the only thing we think we control a lot of stuff, but this is the one thing we really do have control over, is to change the way we decide to think of stuff. And think about Viktor Frankl. I mean, my goodness, if someone can come out of that horror and not be bitter and angry and, ruined in some ways the rest of their lives, and instead go on to help other people, that's doable. We can do this.
Doable. And we have another one from Amy about asking for help again. So asking for help is highly complicated by our current social distancing situation.
Yes, it is.
It limits the kind of help I really want to ask for. What kind of suggestions do you have for Amy?
Amy, I guess it would be ask that question to the person that you're asking to help you. So if you wanted someone to come and stay with your person, so to let you get away, would there be a possibility to do that virtually, for example, or on the telephone? I mean, no, it's not going to be the same, and we know that, but that's where we are right now, and knowing that ideally that's going to change and move as we move on.
I think another thing that recently I've thought of that's been going on in my family is that trying to teach my family members who aren't as technologically savvy just how to use the grocery apps so you can order your groceries.
Yes.
And just remembering that there's restaurant apps that you can use that are offering free services right now. So maybe one of the grandkids, or maybe your neighbor who wants to help that's just really techie, they can just walk you through some of this stuff, and you find out, oh, that was easy, and it's something that I can do that keeps us safe, and it relieves some of the stress that I have. Or maybe it's even somebody that you can give them the order and say, hey, type it in for me, and all I have to do is pay for it. There are some options like that are out there right now. Maybe it's even you're thinking, I so would like to have a memory book so that we could look through those together and kind of blend that into the routine that we have for the day, but I don't know how to do that. So somebody says, hey, in your family, the kids are really bored. What
Perfect.
can we do for you? And you can say, I will leave a stack of photos in a bag on the porch, and it could just be a few, and they could take those and make an actual book, or they could take those and they could put them into something like Shutterfly, you know, scan them into the computer, and then have the book delivered to your home. So there's ways that are new for us to open our eyes to have folks help us during the pandemic.
Janice, those are fabulous. That's brilliant. As you were talking, I just thought of one too about getting family members who say, oh, if they had time, they could help or whatever. You know, asking an adult grandchild, for example, if they'd be willing to order a meal for you and your person from a restaurant and have it delivered, and they take care of it. I mean, that would be a
perfect.
You know, that they could feel like they were helping out, and you could benefit from not having to cook. And the other one,
right. Oh, and Amy says, thank you. All good ideas.
Great. One last one too. And you talked about Lori, our boss.
Our director.
Our director. She doesn't feel like a boss. I learned this one from her, and it's brilliant. And I know, and we're using this with one of our grandchildren because of the pandemic. Visits now, we're visiting through the window. So we go to the house, and our grandson has a telephone, we have a telephone, and we visit through the window for the protection of all of us. So that was something that that she had used, and I thought was brilliant.
So brilliant. So brilliant. Well, I'll wait just a moment to see if there are any other questions. Oh, we've got another one coming up.
Okay.
So we've got somebody typing. They're in the midst of asking their question. But while he's typing, he just says, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I just have to say, Susie, this has been so powerful and so beautiful. And you've told us that ambiguous loss builds resiliency, and that it has benefits. And these benefits are deep, and they can really change the trajectory of our path in life. And I would just encourage folks today, as we're getting ready to wrap up the session, to think about what is one action that I can take away from this, one idea that I can implement in my life. Maybe it's, I'm going to ask for help. Or, Susie, what are a couple of just one things that you think, if I was a person listening today, what are a couple things that I might think, if I was going to do one thing, what might one of those things be?
I think one of those things would, how are you going to take care of yourself? Have you not been exercising? Have you not been eating as well as you could? It would be anything. Have you not allowed yourself to have some time to read for pleasure, to take a bubble bath? Those things are so important to schedule into your day, to schedule into your week.
So powerful. We have got a couple more comments. One is from Gina, and she says, this has been amazing and hits so close to home on really every point.
Oh.
I wish I could meet all of you in person. Just when I thought I couldn't cry anymore, I've teared through this entire time. God bless you all.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Gina. Hey, as we get ready to bring the session to a conclusion, I do want to share a couple things with you. We do have some wonderful opportunities coming up, and we thank you for joining us today. We are excited to share our next virtual event, and it's called Compass After the Dementia Diagnosis. It's coming up on May 14th. And you can register by calling the phone number in the chat bar, but the number, if you don't have the chat open, is 602-230-CARE. And we also have a couple more comments. Thank you from Carrie. And then Gina says, will we have access to this presentation? And yes, it should be posted soon. And you will also get more information when we send an evaluation out to all of you. And in that evaluation, you'll also have the opportunity to sign up for our newsletter that lists what's coming up. So Susie, as we wrap up today, do you have any final comments before we talk about how we can stay connected?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I've been going through these. So if there are any questions, or this is the way to contact me, it's susan.favreau@bannerhealth.com. And then thank you so much. This has been so fun, and what you all came up with has been equally as amazing for me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Susie. And can you jump to the next slide? This one says how to stay connected and get involved. So when you get the evaluation, if you can share your email address, we'll sign you up for free for the Beacon newsletter. That's from Banner Alzheimer's Institute and Banner Sun Health Research Institute. You can like us on Facebook. You can get involved in research. And you can make all those comments in the evaluation that you're going to get if there's anything that you want more information about. We also are providing telehealth appointments, and they're available at all 3 of our clinics. We have more information about that as well if you'll email us, and if you'll make that in your comments with our evaluation. And then finally, we have all sorts of classes and events that are coming up. And you can find those at banneralz.org and look at our calendar. And with that, we have a couple more comments for you, Susie. They say, thank you both. This is the best part of my self-care for today. And thank you for the great presentation. Thank you. And so with that,
hey, Jan,
thank you, Susie.
I have one more thing. Can you tell them about your happy half hours?
Oh, yes, we have happy half hours. And that they will also be announced in our Beacon newsletter. But if you write down in your evaluation that you want more information about that, we can send you the link. We just had a happy half hour this morning from 9:30 to 10 every Wednesday morning to infuse your morning, not only with routine and hope, but we want to infuse your morning with positivity in the midst of these days. So thanks for mentioning that, Susie, and we hope that you will join us in one of our future events that we have.
Thank you. I have a plan to do so.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.